Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Victoria and I am a Christian, feminist, and queer person interested in sharing ideas about what it means to have faith in the modern world. In today's video, I want to talk about queer people in the Bible. If you're at all familiar with Christianity and Christian culture, which I'm sure you are if you've stumbled onto this video, you will have heard that the Bible condemns homosexuality. As theology and scholarship has progressed, many theologians are coming to disagree with that fact, so I will definitely link below my video on queer affirming Christianity if you're interested in hearing about how those 6 clobber passages, as they've come to be known, when read in their cultural context and original language, don't actually condemn homosexuality. But beyond that, in today's video, I want to discuss queer people in the Bible. Are there examples of homosexuality in the Bible outside of those 6 passages that are in fact accepted and or celebrated? You may be thinking, obviously not, you're an idiot. But in today's video, I hope the evidence I present may cause us to question our heteronormative reading of scripture and consider that the Bible may affirm and accept queer relationships. So let's get into it. Most of the information I'm going to be presenting today comes from Epiphany by Michael Coren, particularly in chapter 2. So if you're interested in learning more, I suggest you get a hold of this book and read the whole thing, but in particular, I found chapter 2 the most interesting. If you haven't heard of Michael Coren, he was a famous Catholic speaker from Canada who spent the good part of his career condemning homosexuality. Recently, he has changed his mind on the subject, and so this book is his personal testimony as to how he came to the conclusion to accept queer people from a theological standpoint. So it's quite interesting, but as I said, the information for this video comes from chapter 2 of this book. The first passages we're going to look at come from 1 Samuel in the story of David and Jonathan. It has long been kind of an urban myth or suggested that David and Jonathan may have been in a queer relationship, but if you're anything like me and you came from a traditional conservative background, you would have dismissed this as completely laughable and just people reading in their modern queer lens into an ancient worldview where it was perfectly fine for 2 men to be extremely close. If you're unfamiliar with the story, David was a warrior under King Saul who had a son called Jonathan. Jonathan and David became especially close friends, and when King Saul turned on David, who would later become king, Jonathan warned him and David was able to flee. After an extremely emotional parting, they never saw each other again as Jonathan was killed in battle, and then David adopted Jonathan's son as his own. So were they gay? Let's look at these verses in context. I'm going to start by reading from 1 Samuel chapter 18 verses 4 to 5. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty gay to me. The first thing of note is that the possessions that Jonathan gives to David in the ancient Near East would have been the most important possessions. These are symbolic of his power, his status, really his identity in this context. So if we take the symbolic nature of these possessions together with the concept of him loving him as himself, there appears to be some sort of exchange of identity happening here. This is particularly intriguing when we think about the line one in spirit. It is very reminiscent of one flesh as marriage is described with Adam and Eve. Whatever their relationship is, whether sexual or not, it is clearly something beyond a casual friendship where there is some kind of familial or unification happening here. Let's jump ahead to 1 Samuel chapter 20 verses 41 to 42. This is their final parting before David flees. After the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground. Then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. And Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord is witness between you and me and between your descendants and my descendants forever.'" Then David left, and Jonathan went back to the town. Again, the Bible here doesn't explicitly say if this was a sexual relationship or not, but it does say that they kissed each other. Many people will point to the fact that it was more acceptable for men to kiss each other in ancient cultures, and it didn't necessarily denote anything romantic. But that said, it was often extremely common in ancient cultures for warrior men to take homosexual lovers. This was both encouraged and normalized in the military. So while it is impossible to say what kind of kiss they shared, shared, there is a historical precedent for it being homosexual or heterosexual. The relationship between these two men is described further in 2 Samuel, which may help to enlighten us as to what kind of kiss it may have been. 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 26 to 27 reads, "I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of a woman. How the mighty have fallen, the weapons of war have perished." So this is David lamenting Jonathan's death. Michael Coren points out in his book that the Hebrew language used in this passage is very reminiscent of male-female relationships described elsewhere in the Old Testament. As well, the narrative itself is very reminiscent of the plethora of Greek love stories between male warriors. The fact that he compares his relationship with Jonathan to the love of women, to me seems to suggest there may have been something more going on. Again, while it is impossible to decisively include that David and Jonathan were in a homosexual relationship, the textual evidence alone should cause us to reconsider our heteronormative reading of the text. If you were to change Jonathan to a Judith, for example, there really would be no doubt that we would read this relationship as romantic. The romantic language of the text, the exchanging of items of identity to signify a family bond, the historical precedent for same-sex relationships between male warriors, and this narrative's similarities to other Greek love stories between men certainly should cause us to at least re-examine our reading of this story. Sticking with the Old Testament, let's jump to the story of Ruth and Naomi. In the book of Ruth, Naomi is Ruth's mother-in-law. Both are widowed and essentially left destitute. Naomi decides to return to her hometown, and Ruth declares that she will follow her. They move together, and eventually a landowner named Boaz is captivated by Ruth and eventually marries her, saving both women from destitution. The first thing to point out here is Ruth's declaration when Naomi decides to leave and return to her hometown. Naomi tells both her daughters-in-law, Ruth and another woman, that they should go back to their hometowns to be with their own family, since obviously Naomi cannot provide for them and they are all widowed. In Ruth chapter 1, verses 14, it says, "At this time they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her." The Hebrew word for clung here is debak. I only have half a semester of Hebrew, so please ignore my pronunciation. This is the exact same word that is used in Genesis to describe the purpose of marriage. As all of us, I'm sure, are familiar, particularly those who like to argue against queer affirmation, marriage is between a man and a woman because Adam leaves his parents to cleave to his wife. This word cleave is the exact same Hebrew word as is used to describe Ruth's relationship with Naomi in the book of Ruth. If that doesn't make you pause, I don't know what will. Ruth continues in verse 16, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." Just beautiful. Particularly hilarious, in my view, is that this passage is often used in marriage ceremonies today between heterosexual couples, often by people who would not be affirming if the marriage was taking place between a woman and another woman. And yet these same people find something intrinsically romantic in this passage. We can clearly see the romance in it, and yet, because it's between two women, the interpretation becomes it's just a very deep friendship. Yet again, if this was between a man and a woman, I don't think we would ever question that this is a declaration of deep love and devotion. Of further note in the story, while Ruth does end up married to a man, Boaz, there is no mention of romance in this story between them at all. If we understand the situation of widows in the ancient world, it is easy to see why a heterosexual marriage might be celebrated in a story that could potentially be about love between two women. We see scattered throughout scripture and even in the teachings of Jesus that the widows are people to be cared for. This is because women had very few rights of property ownership, of wealth, of freedom, and so a woman without a man was essentially powerless and extremely vulnerable. Both Naomi and Ruth would have been in this situation. Ruth's marriage to Boaz, therefore, would have been an inevitable practicality of the ancient world and a good thing for both of these women. Marriage was often a political tool, so love often played little to no part. Its primary purpose was for reproduction and inheritance law, and so a woman was lucky if she married someone who treated her well. In this case, Boaz really is a hero as he does rescue both Ruth and Naomi and pull them from poverty. All that to say, it is certainly of note that when Ruth does produce a child with Boaz, Boaz is not even mentioned in the story. Rather, it is Naomi's joy that we hear about. Ruth chapter 4, verses 13 to 17 says, "And she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, 'Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age, for your daughter daughter-in-law who loves you, and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So essentially what this text is saying is, thank you, Boaz, for your sperm, but now this woman whom I love has a child. Again, like with David and Jonathan, it is impossible to draw any sort of decisive conclusions, since the text does not specifically say, "and they made love to each other," or "and they were lesbians." But of course, the concept of a lesbian did not exist in the era in which the Bible was written, so that would be unlikely anyways. But all that to say, we should definitely reconsider our reading of this when we consider the language and context of the story. Let's jump ahead to the New Testament. Matthew chapter 8 verses 5 to 13 tells the story of the centurion and his slave. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. "Lord," he said, "my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly." Jesus said to him, "Shall I come and heal him?" The centurion replied, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed, for I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following him, "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west, and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Then Jesus said to the centurion, "Go, and let it be done just as you believed it would." And his servant was healed at that moment. Let's start by examining a little bit of the cultural context of this passage. The first thing of note is that Jews hated Romans in this period. The Romans were essentially tyrant invaders who had occupied the Jewish nation and set up their own structure of governance and laws. Another thing of note, particularly for today's subject, is that it was a very common insult in this period for Jews to mock Romans for engaging in homosexual affairs. Even without the gay element, however, this story is already beautiful in and of itself for demonstrating the inclusive nature of the gospel and its inherent ability to break down barriers between peoples. There was no reason for the Romans to be included in the good news of a Jewish Messiah, and yet here we see Christ honoring the faith of a Gentile over and above God's chosen people. Diving into the text itself, the Greek word that is used to describe this servant is pais. Again, I'm sorry for my pronunciations. I have only studied a term of Greek. In its original context, this word can be interpreted 3 different ways. The first meaning is boy or son, the second, servant, and the third, a servant who was a gay lover. This story is recounted by Luke in the Gospel of Luke, and he describes the servant with the words entimos doulos. Now, the meaning of doulos can be interpreted only 2 ways: slave or gay lover. So this person was clearly not a boy or son. The word entimos means honored. So what we have in this story is the slave of the centurion who was particularly loved and honored above others. In light of the Jewish view of the Romans, that is, that they frequently participated in homosexual affairs outside of their heterosexual political marriages, it would have been very likely for a first century Jewish audience to interpret this story in accordance with the third meaning of pais, a slave who was a gay lover. Slavery in the first century was particularly harsh, although slavery is always particularly harsh. A slave was property to be used and abused and discarded at will. If they died, it didn't matter, who cares? There were 2 sort of general exceptions to this. For a woman, if her master developed romantic feelings from her outside of their sexual intercourse, because it was very common for a master to have sex with his slaves, regardless of what they said in the matter. But if that sexual intercourse developed into something more romantic, she could be honored more than just as a piece of property. And for a male, later in life, if he had earned the trust and respect of the master, he could become an advisor or sort of a father figure to the rest of the household. While again, it is not entirely clear what position this particular servant held, it seems to me, and to Michael Coren, that this was highly likely to be a homosexual relationship. When we consider the frequency of homosexual relationships among the Romans, the way certain slaves could be elevated through romantic relationships with their masters, and the way that this servant is described as honored and beloved by the centurion, that's enough to convince me, at least, that these 2 men were possibly in love. I can think of certainly very few other reasons why a hardened military man would describe another man man he owned as especially honored, beloved, or cherished. So if we conclude that this was in fact a homosexual relationship, what this story reveals is that when presented with a gay couple, Jesus did not condemn them or rebuke them for their sin. Rather, he praised their faith, recognizing in the centurion an understanding of the gospel which surpassed many of the religious authorities of the day. That's some piping hot tea. The final example I'm going to talk about today comes from the book of Acts. This is the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, who can be considered the first Gentile convert to Christianity. But an angel of the Lord spoke to Philip. The angel said, "Arise and go southward along the road that goes from Jerusalem down to Gaza. This area is deserted." But Philip arose and went, and behold, there was a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority under Candace, queen of the Ethiopians. He was responsible for all her treasure. He'd been to Jerusalem to worship, and now he was returning, seated in his chariot reading the prophet Isaiah. The Spirit told Philip, "Go closer and meet this chariot." Philip ran to the man and heard him reading Isaiah the prophet. Philip said, "Do you understand what you are reading?" The man replied, "How can I unless someone explains it to me?" He implored Philip to come up and sit with him. Now this is the passage of scripture the man was reading. "He was led as a sheep to the slaughter. As a lamb before his shearer is silent, so he opened not his mouth. In his humiliation his judgment was taken away. Who will declare his generation? His life is taken from the earth." The eunuch further replied to Philip by asking, "Who is the prophet talking about, himself or someone else?" Philip opened his mouth and, beginning from this scripture, preached to him about Jesus. As they went along the way, they came to some water. The eunuch said, "Look, here is water. What prevents me from being baptized?" Philip replied, "If you believe with your whole heart, you may be baptized." The man said, "I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God." Having said that, he commanded the chariot to halt. Both he and Philip went down together into the water, and there Philip immersed the eunuch. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord caught Philip away, and the eunuch saw him no more. The eunuch went on his way rejoicing. I want to start by exploring the Greek word for eunuch here. It is eunuchos, I don't know, which means guardian or keeper. This word was only used by men who were completely trusted by a monarch, governor, or ruler. As we can see here, he was trusted by a famous queen and given guardianship over her treasure. Frequently, these kinds of eunuchs were given the care of women, again as we see with this queen. This meant they had to be completely non-threatening and above reproach. There were two kinds of eunuchs frequent in the first century. The first was those who were literally castrated, and the second, those who were considered natural or born eunuchs. In the case of castration, while this prevents men from having children, it does not always cause or remove male sexual desire. This would have been extremely problematic for a man given the care of wealthy or noble women, for whom in this cultural context, virginity and fidelity to one's husband was essential because of the need to know fatherhood for inheritance laws, particularly amongst the wealthy. The second kind of eunuch, one who was a born or natural eunuch, was in this context a man who had no sexual desire for women. These men would have been statistically safer to employ as the guardian or keepers of women and or the various administrative tasks surrounding them. Again, it is impossible to know exactly which kind of eunuch this man was, but based on the two different types and the job we know this eunuch had, it seems likely he could have been the latter, a man who was not attracted to women at all, or a gay man. And certainly some of these men were associated with homosexual relationships. Judaism at this time refused conversion by eunuchs in general. They were considered unclean and or sexual outcasts. It is of note that Philip doesn't ask the eunuch what kind of eunuch he was, ask him to change his sexual preferences, or to know whether he was physically castrated. He simply accepts him as he is and for his faith. In the cultural context, when the eunuch asks Philip, "What is to prevent me from being baptized?" the cultural answer was everything. Your status as a eunuch, you are unclean and not acceptable into the Jewish faith. Yet, through the gospel and the message of Jesus, we see Philip providing a different answer. There is nothing. Do you have faith and do you believe in Jesus? To be saved, that was the only question that mattered, and so the eunuch was baptized. And so, it will make many of you very uncomfortable to learn that likely the first Gentile convert to Christianity was in fact a black gay man. To conclude this video, I of course want to reiterate that it is very difficult when reading scripture in any kind of way to draw decisive conclusions about what it says. We are always looking through the lens of our own cultural understanding into another lens of yet another cultural understanding, this time of the ancient world. Reading scripture accurately requires a lot of work examining the historical and cultural contexts, and from there trying to figure out how that relates to us today. It is a very difficult process, and this is why we have so many denominations and interpretations. All that to say, it is hard to conclusively say that all of these people were gay, but I will say for me, when you read the original language and context, I'm quite convinced that at least some of them were. If I haven't convinced you of the same, I hope that these narratives at least cause you to pause and reconsider your interpretation. Because of the history of anti-queerness in the church, it is very easy to read scripture with a heteronormative lens and just assume that any hints of homosexuality in the Bible were just really close straight friends. I hope that through this video I've prompted you to re-examine that lens and to consider that perhaps the Bible features a lot more queer people than we are otherwise led to believe. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed watching it. Make sure to give it a like if you enjoyed. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on this topic. Please keep it civil, keep it kind, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye.